This is a Media Lab podcast. Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert, and today is a special day, but I do have to give a little bit of backstory, which is Mr. William White is here, but he on his last appearance, he said, you know who you should get to come and talk about the movie Stavisky with you is Brian Stokes Mitchell, and I thought, that's a good get. Let's see if I can get Broadway legend Brian Stokes Mitchell to be on my podcast. And so I went into a period of about 3 to 4 weeks of trying to get him to be on this show. And I sent emails to his agents. I scoped him out on Instagram and slid into his DMs. I called his office and left a message, and I received nothing back. So as a second option, I am introducing you to William White once again onto this podcast. So thank you for being Brian Stokes Mitchell's backup.
Always glad to be the understudy, Kyle. Happy to come on in whatever circumstances you may require.
Great. From talking to you before we push record, you have never seen this movie before, but you are somewhat knowledgeable about the music from this movie. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, I hadn't seen the movie until preparing for the show, but now I have. And the music, I mean, I'll just mention like why I recommended Brian Stokes Mitchell to you is because the one time that I worked with him, when I used to be the assistant conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, he came to do a pop show with us. And we just got around to talking backstage. And, you know, of course, anybody who I can waylay into a conversation about Stephen Sondheim, I immediately do. And I was so surprised that he immediately brought up Stavisky. And maybe he thought that, you know, he was just going to shut me up and not have to talk about me. But I was more than happy to talk about Stavisky. But yeah, he was a real fan. He really, I mean, he could sing all of the themes. He was really into it. He talked about the orchestration, you know, which is by Jonathan Tunick yet again.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's why I thought that he would be a good person to come on the show. But, you know, hey, you made every effort that you possibly could. It is quite apparent.
Maybe he'll eventually return my calls and we can set something up in the future. But I also have this entirely vision about you talking to anyone you can about Sondheim, like your local coffee barista's like, oh God, this guy again.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I think every barista in a 2-mile radius is glad that I don't drink coffee. So they don't have to deal with me.
Well, you know, before we jump into the music here, I think it might be beneficial just to talk about the movie in general. This is not really going to be a film review necessarily. I guess just generally, how did you enjoy the movie-going experience, Will?
I liked the movie, I would say. It's an incredibly appealing movie in terms of the production design.
Yeah.
Like everything about the movie is really cool. I mean, from the sets to the locations to the costumes, you know, this takes place basically in 1933, although I understand that there are some scenes that are flashbacks and some scenes that are flash forwards, which were very difficult to discriminate upon my first viewing. But yeah, I mean, the production design is exquisite. I mean, we are talking like Downton Abbey level detail work in terms of the look of the movie.
And are you familiar with the actual historical figure of Stavisky at all?
No, I had no idea about
I
him.
did. Okay, I guess I felt bad because it's like, I guess I don't know a lot about French history because I have no idea who this person is. But he's very famous
you would
over
have
there.
to know quite a bit about French history. I mean, you know, this is like certainly a couple levels below something like the.
Were you thinking of the Dreyfus affair?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so this is like 2 or 3 levels deeper than, say, the Dreyfus affair, which is, you know, better known to like students of international history. But Stavisky, I mean, you know, we're talking about like a minor person who, you know, this is very much internal French politics. But I mean, just the cars and the look of like the, you know, the way that what I think is really successful in a period piece is if not everything that you see is from 1933, you see a mix of stuff that is sort of Golden Age, Second Empire, Art Deco. You know, it's everything from 1933 and before. And they do a really good job of capturing that, and also capturing like the personality of the characters through their costuming choices. I mean, the fact that Stavisky always has a fresh carnation in his lapel, you know, I mean, and so that just shows how, what kind of a dandy and an ostentatious person that he is. So I like that. I like French film from this period in general. So I just do like the look of the texture of the film stock itself, you know? And then, of course, the music is great and the performances are good. I assume if I could have been able to figure out who any character in this was, or like, you know, what the sequence of the plot was, then I'm sure it would have been really great.
To pull back the curtain a little bit here, this is going to be funny because I actually didn't tell you about this, but up here in Canada, this movie is available on iTunes to buy or rent. And down in the lowly US, you can't. There's apparently no streaming option right now to actually view this movie. Through nefarious means, I found a website that probably now has all my information sent to the Russians that had it with English subtitles that I sent off to you. I don't know how good those subtitles are. I ended up actually watching that version because I didn't read the fine print on the version I rented. That was only in French with no subtitles. So I got 5 minutes in, I'm like, oh, no, this is not going to work because I have no idea what is going on.
Well, we should have switched because
French is not keeping up.
I'm a French speaker, and the subtitles were very good. You know, they were very good.
I'm pretty similar to you. I will say that, yeah, I don't know how much I really enjoyed the movie overall. I'm pretty medium on it as a film by itself, but I do agree with all the stuff that you enjoyed about it. Production design, great. Performances are very good. I enjoyed all the music from this. Sondheim gets into this like weird semantic argument that he wasn't the composer of this. He was, what does he say? He says he did scoring. He did not do orchestrations or something like that. He makes a very fine discernment about what he actually contributed to this movie.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't see that. I mean, you know, this is definitely different than something like Reds, where he just, you know, played a kind of one-off theme idea that then got used for the opening titles and then was orchestrated, you know, and extended and sort of spotted by somebody else. I mean, this, you know, from everything I read, he really wrote all the music here.
He did. So I don't know why he makes this weird distinction. Anyways, he kind of downplays his involvement in this film for whatever reason. But yeah, like I said, like this is a great showcase, I think, of Sondheim, Jonathan Tunick. I like now listening to this score just by itself, which I've done over the last couple of days, because I really had not interacted with this movie up until this week. Never seen the movie. So this was all fresh for me, kind of going into this, and like enjoyed my experience overall. But I'll probably be returning back to the score more often than I'm going to be returning to the movie, is kind of how I term it for people.
Yeah, and I mean, a good score has that quality for me of it's like sort of an emotional outline of the movie. You know, I mean, and especially if you've seen a movie a number of times, so that you've subconsciously imbibed the score so many times that when you hear the score, it's an automatic shorthand for what's going on in the movie. And I love listening to scores that way. I mean, like one of my favorite scores is the score to the movie Anti-Mame. I don't know if you've seen that one. A great classic.
No, that's so funny.
But the score is just, it's so voluptuous. And the scenes are so distinct in terms of like geography and the characters involved that you hear those and it immediately brings to mind what's going on in the movie. I
agree. Yeah, I have an entire playlist of scores that I just like kind of coming back to. A very recent one that I actually love and I'm disappointed it didn't get as recognized as it should have was actually the score to Phantom Thread.
Oh, that's a great score. Johnny Greenwood. Score. Yeah, of course.
You can enjoy that without having seen the movie, I think. I think it's beautifully
It's a
done.
Beautiful score. I mean, you know, I had been a little bit of a skeptic on Johnny Greenwood up until then. Although I liked, you know, what he did on There Will Be Blood and The Master. But boy, I mean...
Phantom Thread is like a step above,
Phantom
I think,
Thread, I mean, he really captures that era, you know, of the 1950s, the sort of very perfumed strings sound and the waltz and everything. And I think that's one of the great successes of this score, of Stavisky too, is that it captures the era.
Hey everyone, I am breaking into the conversation here just to do our thanks of sponsors and everything. So I'm apologizing that I'm so rudely just inserting myself in here. One thing before I talk about anything else. Boy, I am obsessed with something. The people over on the Patreon know this already, and it's going all around Twitter and my Instagram, so you've probably seen this already. But there's a television show on American television called Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist. And the guest star this past week was a Miss Bernadette Peters, where she sings Sia's song Cheap Thrills. It has given me so much joy over the last 36 hours that I have known of its existence. And I have watched it probably 272 times. It is so glorious. Even playing a clip would not give it justice. So I am putting a link into the show notes. Please go and watch this and then let me know how much I have improved your life. But this episode of Putting It Together is brought to you by the Calgary Foundation, proudly supporting community needs for 65 years. Whether someone is battling depression, fleeing domestic abuse, or worried about putting food on the table, it's times like these that inspire people to help others during a period of unprecedented needs. The Calgary Foundation is here to help. Through the generous support of donors, the foundation offers a wide range of funding opportunities for organizations who share a common goal of building a healthy, giving, caring, and resilient community, one where everyone thrives. If you're part of a registered charity looking for a grant, discover a wealth of resources at calgaryfoundation.org and learn more about the Calgary Foundation on their Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube channel. This episode of Putting It Together is also brought to you by Park Power, your friendly local utilities provider in Alberta, offering internet, electricity, and natural gas with low rates, awesome service, and profit sharing with local charities. In Alberta, you get to choose who to buy your internet, electricity, and natural gas from. If you switch providers, nothing changes about the delivery of these utilities to your home or business. If you have an existing contract, you're going to want to find out the terms before leaving. If you don't, then it's even easier to sign up for Park Power. You, as the consumer, have the choice of who you pay your bills to. Why not choose your friendly, local utilities provider? Learn more at parkpower.ca. I should also let you know that if you'd like to help support this show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That is greatly appreciated. And if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thanks to the God That's Good tier from Patreon, the triumphant quartet of Jack, Todd, Barry, and Carrie. Now, let's go back to Stavisky. Well, just to go through a little bit of backstory here. So this movie was released on May 15th, 1974. If you don't believe what we think about the movie, it is currently rated 6.5 on IMDb. There's no rating on Metacritic for whatever reason. And then from 11 critics, which is pretty low for Rotten Tomatoes, but on the Rotten Tomatoes, 11 critics have it at 91%, and then 250 plus users have it at 58%. So a little bit of a divide there.
Yeah, this is more of a critical darling than a wide public success, I would think.
I am probably going to very much mispronounce some people's names here, but written by Jorge Semprún and then directed by Alain Resnais. So apparently here's the story. I don't know how true this is. I only found this on like one website on the internet. So there's really not a lot of like corroboration on this fact. But so apparently the story is that Resnais was this huge fan of Follies, had somehow seen the Broadway production, loved it. So when Sondheim was in France promoting The Last of Sheila in 1973, he asked if he would come over and score his movie, and Sondheim agreed. A little fun fact is apparently that Resnais would play the score to A Little Night Music on the set to get the actors in the mood, whatever that means.
I also read that, yeah. I'll corroborate that for you.
Okay, great. If you are a film fan, I mean, Resnais, his other culturally significant movie, this is very much my opinion, but would probably be Hiroshima, My Love, which came out in 1959. Semprun's other big film he wrote was Z, which would go on to greatly inspire the French Connection and how like that's filmed, a very like documentary type style. Resnais has said that what attracted me to the character of Alexandre was the connection to the theater, the show business.
Alexandre being Stavisky, which is sort
Correct.
of a pseudonym, yeah.
Correct. To show business in general. Stavisky seemed to me like an incredible actor, the hero of a serial novel. He had the gift of bringing reality to his fantasies by means of regal gestures. So that is what inspired him to go and create this. I do believe the score is available like by itself. However, the way that I have it is that it was actually included in the Follies 1985 concert 2-disc CD set. So one CD is, I will say, like 2/3, 4/5 of the Follies concert. Then CD2 has like the last 5 songs from the Follies concert and then the entire score of Stavisky. I don't know why they decided to do it that way, but that is how my edition works.
Well, I mean, you know, when you put out a 2 CD set, you kind of want to fill them up as best as you can.
That's right.
But it does make sense to me. I mean, Follies is linked to this score for a number of reasons.
Well, yeah, for a number of reasons. I think we can probably jump into that. But just talking about this score by itself, there is deep Follies vibes I get from this score. Like and not just because he uses the theme from Bring On the Girls in one of the scenes. Like it's literally just that song,
right?
No words. For the song that they call Auto Show. But even like there's other songs that like reference like not reference, but they sound so similar to like the Girls Upstairs. There's just a bunch of stuff that is like, ooh, that sounds it. Weirdly though, I also feel like it's this weird like Follies and a Little Night Music mashup.
Yes,
like there's things that like seep in from each other. But maybe you, as like a composer, can tell me exactly what it is that I'm hearing.
Well, I think that Sondheim is, as he was in Follies, he's trying to evoke a period in this piece. So the period here is the interwar period, let us call it, in Europe. Ostensibly 1933, as I mentioned, is the main year that this takes place, which would put it, you know, sort of in the same time frame as Follies in terms of the pastiche songs. I mean, right. Follies, you know, probably goes back into the teens. You know, I think that we talked about that there's, you know, operetta involved in Follies. And
there's an operetta in this score, too.
Comme mon cœur, mais lui je ne le vendrai jamais, jamais. C'est vrai, jamais.
There's an operetta in this score too, and much like, you know, the cars and the costumes are not just all from 1933, they're from, you know, the decades leading up to 1933.
Right.
The score, I think, has nods to music leading up to 1933. So it puts you in this world where you're basking in everything that these characters would have been basking in. And that gets you up to the current time, you know.
What are some of the standouts for you? Like, I mean, this is definitely like a Sondheim Tunic collaboration once again. So what do you feel like each person is bringing to this?
Well, it's the stuff that they always bring to their collaborations. I mean, I would start just with the opening, the générique, the opening credit sequence, which is so good. Oh my gosh, the you know, the overture to this movie, is great. And right away, I think that what you get is, in terms of the orchestration, you get a sense of the period with, like, for example, the banjo keeping the beat. That to me just speaks of Kurt Weill, for example. who's, a German composer of 1900 to 1950. This is the exact sweet spot, the middle of his life, the high point of his career. He composed like the Threepenny Opera, Mahagoni, Lady in the Dark, lots of big jazz things that became jazz standards. But this kind of Weimar Republic cabaret music. Mm-hmm. And so you get that. And then, the main theme in the overture is played by the soprano saxophone. And that, that gets you to the early days of jazz, Sidney Bechet, people like that.
Well, it definitely, when it started, I'm like, ooh, this could almost be the opening to like The Great Gatsby or something like that. Like it has that kind of jazzy feel almost.
Exactly. Like a society orchestra. And I think that you hear different versions of that. There are these tracks that are called Au Claridge. So Claridge is the name of the main hotel in France where Stavisky lived, in Paris, where he lives. And there you hear a piano trio, so piano, violin, and cello. And I just think that is exactly what you would have heard in the 1920s and 30s as the sort of, tea time, tea room ambiance music. They've got all these great like potted palms dotting the hotel atelier. And it's just perfect. It's great.
Before we get too far away from Kurt Weill, because you sent me a example of his work.
Mm-hmm. Oh, show us the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, we must find the next whiskey bar. Oh, if we don't find the next whiskey bar, I tell you we must die. I tell you we must die. I tell you we must die.
Do you know who covered that song years and years later?
Tell me.
The Doors.
The Doors have it. Sure. The Alabama song, right?
Yeah. So which is played in At World's End, if you've ever seen that movie.
No, I haven't.
Well, show me the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. Show me the way to the next whiskey bar.
My great interpreter of Kurt Weill, and I'm a huge fan of Kurt Weill, I should say. He's one of my favorite composers. To me, nobody interprets Kurt Weill better than Marianne Faithfull, the one-time girlfriend of Mick Jagger and folk singer of British renown. But her parents they lived in Berlin in the 1930s, and they were friends with Kurt Weill, and so she has a real connection to it. And so, it's hard to find her recordings of his stuff sometimes, but if anybody's interested, I would strongly recommend them.
You also sent me some other examples here. What makes you think of Prokofiev?
There's one cue in here that I would like to sort of dive into a little bit. Yeah. And to me, it's musically one of the more interesting ones. It's the one that is called Le Bureau la Nuit. So this is the one where Stavisky's sort of henchman is at night standing outside of the office. He's looking to see if the guy who Stavisky has just met with has left the building and made sure that nobody else has come in the building. And this track, I sent you the Prokofiev Toccata, which is sort of like a pounding piano sonata. And just the way that the Yeah, the low piano was sort of grumbling around here, made me think of that. What this cue actually made me think of more than anything is the soundtrack to Sneakers. Did you ever see that movie with the?
Oh my god! Well, Robert Redford.
Robert Redford, yeah, exactly.
Years and years ago, I could not reference it right now. No.
That's a great score. I mean, I think it's a very fun movie too. But this would be anachronistic. I'm not saying that was an influence on Sondheim, but Sondheim might have been an influence on that score. But this like low piano, which really got copied a lot in sort of like legal thrillers in the 1990s. I think you hear it in a lot of like John Grisham adaptations.
Yeah.
But I think that Sondheim and Tunick take it a step further here because you've got the English horn playing a very sort of frenzied theme. You've got then bassoons coming. You've got all these interesting low woodwind instruments that are sort of poking around and fighting each other. I could think of even other composers a little bit more on the avant-garde side, like Edgard Varese or the Iron Foundry. I can't remember the name of the composer who wrote that. It's a very obscure one, but just some of these early modernist composers, I think that are an influence here, and so for that reason, I found that particularly interesting.
Mosolov, I don't know how to say his name.
Yeah, that's the guy. Uh-huh.
I guess what it comes down to. Or not comes down to, I think what I really resonated with, and I think this points to a great score where it doesn't overpower the scenes that they're in. Like, really, a score is there to support the action that you were visually seeing. And like you were saying at the beginning, kind of does that shorthand, like, oh yeah, I remember this scene. I know what's going on here when you listen to it later on. I'm actually and I think we've had this conversation maybe even on the show before, but what's your sense about why Sondheim didn't do more of this?
That's a great question. And as I was researching this episode, I think I found a pretty compelling answer to that. He said that he found this one of his most satisfying writing experiences of his life.
Right.
And that makes sense because Sondheim, let's not forget, is a huge cinephile.
Yeah, 100%.
And
of like French and Italian cinema,
right, new wave European stuff. But he loves film scores. He's talked about that extensively in terms of the connection to film music and Sweeney Todd.
Yeah.
So it is a bit of a surprise that he didn't do more film work. Although when you really think about it, like in the 70s, he was on movie sets a lot. Because he wrote the End of Sheila. He did this. He did
the 7% connection.
The 7% connection.
Or whatever that's what it's called.
And then, of course, the film versions of his musicals that got made.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but why?
That's true. Yeah. There's a lot. He was on film sets probably a lot in the 70s. Yeah.
But this is the only, full film score that he wrote. And apparently what he said was that if he would have free reign, he would have done it all the time. But the problem is, and it shows up in this film, is that the director ends up cutting out half of what he writes.
Right.
And so, for example, one thing that sort of explained to me why the plot of this movie was so inscrutable is that apparently in the script, there was way more stuff about Trotsky. Trotsky is like this side plot with this whole little cadre of characters, these like French communists who are like worshipful of, and they keep showing up, and you're just like, what does this have to do with anything?
Well, this is what I mean. It's like, if you don't really, because I had to look it up afterwards. Like, if you don't really know this story, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense what's going on partway through. It's like, it doesn't really give you a lot to work with.
Right. And if you look at the track listing on the soundtrack album, there are a number of, there's like Trotsky à Saint-Palais. There are a lot of Trotsky tracks. And Sondheim said that one of the most annoying things about this, even though he said that he thought that Alain Resnais respected his work and used it respectfully, but he says that, Resnais ended up chopping out all of the Trotsky or half of the Trotsky material. So a lot of his score got thrown out. And you can hear the editing of the score in this movie, like, especially if you've, like I knew the score pretty well before having watched the movie. So I could hear where they artificially cut off a track halfway through it, or where you only heard a tiny little reference to the song that's in here. You know, the sort of Follies number.
I do agree. Even for, I was going to point that out. Like that Follies number that is in here, that Bring on the Girls, like there's a harsh like boom, like it's not even like a fade out. It's like it just ends and then goes to another score bit,
right,
and it comes back to that score bit. It's like it's weird if you're like listening for it.
Yeah, I mean, and Leonard Bernstein, you know, I mean, great friend of Sondheim, said the same thing. I mean, he wrote the score to On the Waterfront, and he said, you know, I mean, I loved writing the music, but all of my best stuff ended up on the cutting room floor.
Huh. Interesting. I think you also sent out over another song piece here, the one that I haven't listened to yet. Sorry, The Story of the Unknown Actor. What was that about?
Okay, so this is just, I mean, this is a very personal thing. This is where my two great musical loves, this score is where they come closest to overlapping. So as much as I will talk about Sondheim to anybody I meet, and I love, you know, coming on your show and just, you know, like waxing for, you know, hours at a time. My other great musical love, who is sort of even more obscure than Sondheim, is a Russian composer named Alfred Schnittke. Composer of 9 symphonies, you know, many concerti grosso, 4 violin concertos, 4 string quartets. I will not bore you and your audience with that, but he also wrote over 60 film scores. That's
our spin-off podcast we're actually developing.
Oh my God. Just don't even tempt me. But, you know, Schnittke wrote over 60 film scores. He's a Russian composer. He wrote for Mosfilm, which is the main, you know, state-supported movie studio in the USSR. And his life is roughly concurrent with Sondheim's. He died in 98, so he you know, Sondheim has outlived him a lot. But I just thought that I would send you this as an example of the way that they sort of were operating in a little bit of the same world here sonically. Sure. So this is just a great cue from one of Schnittke's film scores that I think you get a little bit of a sense of how they overlap.
Is there any like super famous film scores that he did?
No, I mean, as much as like the films of Alain Resnais, you know, you'd have to find a pretty big film buff to know like The Last Year at Marienbad, which is actually the only other Resnais film that I've seen. You would have to find like a Russian film specialist to know anything.
Right, gotcha. Okay. I guess one of the other big things that I really wanted to have a discussion about, and I guess we kind of have touched on this a little bit because, you know, things get put onto the cutting room floor. But I do think that like film scores are probably the closest that a lot of people get to like listening to classical music.
Yes, I agree.
In this day and age. Mm-hmm. And yet it's very different. Like this, like they are not necessarily the same thing as like I'm going to hear a concerto or an overture or whatever it happens to be, a song cycle of some kind. I guess to break it down, like what is similar between your traditional classical music and a film score?
Well, I think that you put it well, which is to say that film scores in a way have preserved the sound of the orchestra. You know, that is truly most people's one and only interaction with the sound of an orchestra. But for that reason, the orchestra has retained a familiarity to a lot of people. And so for that reason, I think that film scores are greatly to be lauded. I mean, aside from their own artistic value, and the value that they add to a film. But, you know, you do see this question come up, you know, are film scores classical music? Well, it all depends on the film score. I mean, I mean, this Stavisky, there are certainly parts of this that I would think of as being pretty darn classical. I mean, the film scores of John Williams, you know, those have become part of the classical canon. because every orchestra plays them, but to make money, of course, but also because they're great music and because they are so connected to the great canon of classical composers. There are other composers that I love who have composed, there's some great classical composers who have written film scores like, Vaughan Williams or Prokofiev or Shostakovich. And then there are more contemporary composers whose music I think really does call back and have that classical sound to it. Even somebody like Alexandre Desplat, who writes scores for the other Anderson, Wes Anderson.
That's right.
Or somebody like my current favorite film score composer is Alberto Iglesias, who writes the scores for all of Pedro Almodovar's films.
Right.
There's a guy, Philippe Crombie, who's a French composer who writes for François Ozon. So, there is definitely a connection. But I mean, then you got people like Hans Zimmer, who's just writing these undifferentiated, like melodyless, bah, bah scores. And, that's nothing. But then the grand majority of the scores today are not orchestral or have orchestra as a very minor component. So, I don't know. I personally sort of think that the golden age of film scoring is probably past us, and there's a few great, adherents of it now. But no, I think I love film scores. I'm not like one of these fanboys who knows like every cue of everything and, just like floods these online forums and stuff. I mean, there are a lot of people like that, and more power to them. But, I'm not one of them.
I always feel like I'm getting so close to like old man yells at cloud territory when I bring this topic up, which is like, and I also don't want it to sound like I'm thinking like every modern film is bad. That's never my intention. But there is something to be said when I go back to like 70s film, and it's like these lush scores are there. I love the film stock that they use, and there's just something about it. There's something about that feel to it. It's like, yeah, like this is a movie.
I mean, for people like you and me, they become these fetish objects, which is an issue in and of itself. But I mean, I don't really care. I'm happy to fetishize them.
I guess where I'm driving at here is that so many things seem to be in this like they work on a pendulum, right? Where there's like an adherence to classical forms, and then it swings wildly to be like, let's break it all apart, and then it kind of swings back to be like, well, let's go back to some of like these things that have worked in the past. And I guess I'm wondering if that sound, that classical music sound, will make a comeback in 15 years from now, or not, or we're just past that and we're just going to keep moving forward.
I doubt it. I mean, people ask it because I'm a composer, and so here's I'll tell you sort of a little story here. I write music that is, I write concert music. So music that's meant to be performed by orchestras, chamber ensembles, choirs, stuff like that. I occasionally write theatrical, kind of songs, stuff. I occasionally have written film scores. But my bread and butter is concert music. And the kind of concert music that I like is influenced by people like Stephen Sondheim, for example, by people who influenced Stephen Sondheim, the Debussys and Ravels and Brahmses of the world. And so in the context where my music is played, oftentimes the new music that is played is much more avant-garde, much less listener-friendly. So people will come up to me and after performances of mine, and they'll say, "Oh, I loved your music. It's you should write for movies. It sounds like a film score or something." And that used to annoy me because, for me, like the piece that I have written is the movie. It's like, no, you should be following the narrative of this. Like, this is my story in music. This piece would overwhelm a movie. Like, it's too much for a movie. It's like you're saying it should, a film score should be the background.
Right.
But I have learned to interpret that comment as just saying, I like your music because I recognize the sound of it. And it goes back to what I was saying before about how film scores have maintained the sound of the orchestra in people's mind. So I don't know exactly if that answers what your point was, but that's just a little personalization.
I mean, I never have a point with anything, but no, I think what I'm discovering as I get older is kind of something that you just locked into there. When you get to a certain level, like you've seen so much or you've been exposed to so many different forms, you do start to go down for me at least, a more heady approach. So like I just enjoy listening, of course, to the music of Stephen Sondheim. I have an entire podcast about it, and I do search out for music that does like challenge me. That is not like, here's just like a pop ballad for like the 999th time. Not that I can't enjoy that other stuff, but it's like that's the music that I enjoy like interacting with on a daily basis is the other stuff. But that's also almost impenetrable to the people that are only listening to the other stuff. And so you have to be like, okay, well, you have to go through these 5 steps to kind of get here to maybe be able to interact with this. And that's getting harder and harder. What I've observed, and maybe this is unfair, but what I've observed is that as we've been given more and more choice, it has never been easier to listen to basically any musician who has ever lived, like what their music sounds like. You can basically watch any single film that you could ever think of online somehow. And yet I find that people stick to like, these are the 3 things I know, and these are the only 3 things I'm going to interact with. And that seems so bizarre to me as a kid who grew up and be like, I want to see all this stuff that I have no access to. This is getting into a rant, I realize.
Well,
but I do feel like there is a bit of
we both tended towards ranting a little bit. But I did realize, back to your question, will the orchestral scores, will there be a pendulum swing back? I doubt that in any major way there will be, just because the nuts and bolts of how film scoring is done these days has changed so much. Film scores are made in composers' living rooms, basically, at this point.
That's true.
I mean, it's all done on DAWs, digital audio workspaces. It's all done with samples. And then maybe if you have enough budget for it, you then like overlay, you get a string orchestra in there or something like that. But so, yeah, I mean, just the economics and the technology of it. I think that there will still be a small contingent of art film, and you'll have some crazy director that gets a big enough budget that, they love that sound, or they're making a period piece and they want to go back to it. So I do think that they will exist, but in any terms of like a big swing back, I don't think so. I mean, but this is like what Sondheim says. This is one of my very favorite quotes of his. Is he says that he never had to worry about his music going out of fashion because it was never in fashion, and I love
that. Well, I think what that really points to, too, is like there are definitely artists, musicians, it really doesn't matter what flavor of artistry you're doing, but you can sometimes break them apart like that, where it's like, ooh, they're very much of their time. Like they captured that feeling and that mood really well. But there are those artists that are able to be timeless, right? They weren't chasing after what was like super popular at the time. It's like, no, this is just what feels right to me. And those are the people that do tend to get like revived constantly, is because, it doesn't have to be so tied to that.
Right. And I think any given artist, including Sondheim, is a mixture of both. I mean, Lord knows Company is a period piece.
Oh, yes, a lot. Yeah.
And I think it's none the worse for that. I think the period pieces get a bad rap. I mean, I love a good period piece. Like Stavisky, perfect example.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very successful period piece. But, there's no reason that I would love to see the next production of Company be a hard 1970s, everybody's in turtlenecks, and bad hair kind of an approach, and like, let's go back to the time.
Yeah, everyone actually has to have Sondheim's hair that he had in the early 70s. Like, everyone has to have it.
That's another, I mean, a totally in the weeds connection here, but that is another connection between Alfred Schnittke and Stephen Sondheim. If you look at Alfred Schnittke in 1970, like, even though he's in Moscow and Sondheim's in New York, they actually had a very similar look.
Do they also both have like a behind the scenes making of a track and guiding their singers to get the right path?
Unfortunately not, because I would give anything to see that from Schnittke. But yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on here, William. We did talk about Stavisky for a little bit. But I mean, I guess overall, I think I know what your answer would be, but just to put a fine point on it, would you recommend people go and listen to this score, even divorced from the movie?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I would recommend the film to a certain kind of person,
Right.
a person who's willing to read several synopses before they watch a film.
Definitely read the Wikipedia article of Stavisky's life, because it'll make a lot more sense, I think, when you watch the movie, what's going on.
But the music is great. The music is really good.
Yeah. Well, how can people find you online if they want to continue on?
Twitter.com is a great place to find me. I spend all too much time there. And then, of course, my own podcast, The Classical Gab Fest, is to be found where all good podcasts are downloaded. And, so if you like this kind of talk about... Boy, Kyle, we got through this entire podcast, and I did not bring up Maurice Ravel. This is
it's like a new record.
But if you want to hear talk about people like Ravel and Debussy with me and my two co-hosts on the Classical Gab Fest, go ahead and download that for you people who do come at this Sondheim thing from a little bit more my angle, which is the classical music angle. You might like that.
And if you want to hear me and Will continue to talk, we're actually going to be putting a bonus episode up on Patreon talking about another thing that Sondheim scored, about a decade before this movie came out. So head on over there if you want to listen to us talk a little bit more about Sondheim's scoring.
Yeah, this is going to be deep cut Sondheim, but if you're interested in, the instrumental music that Sondheim wrote, the what we might call the incidental music, music like this written for a movie. We're going to talk about music for a play, Invitation to a March, by that old creep, Arthur Lawrence.
That old creep. I do have to say, I know we're closing, but I do have to say that I wish I had known a little bit more about Arthur Lawrence back when I was doing like West Side Story, Gypsy, Do I Hear a Waltz, all that kind of stuff. I knew like a little bit surface level. Boy, the more I get to know about Arthur Lawrence, the bigger of a jerk he comes off as.
I agree. He seems very unappealing. It's strange that Sondheim just, is so reverential towards him and just loves working with him and stuff. So.
We're not going to be making an Arthur Lawrence podcast anytime soon.
No.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. And you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Thank you to the Alberta Podcast Network, to the Calgary Foundation, and to Park Power this week. Putting It Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we are going on a bit of a diversion. So with multiple characters, people coming back from the dead, and just trying to make sense of it all, we're going to be talking about Candide. It's the best of all possible worlds. As always, a big thanks to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.
But I got you, baby.
I'm kind of busy right now, Ben.